And thank you everyone for joining me on such a warm and sunny evening to listen to my talk about imitative translations of Beowulf. Now, of course, the Anglo-Saxon poem Beowulf exists in very many translations, 300 overall, and counting, into both prose and verse of various forms and styles. Some verse translators use accentual meter and alliteration to, in some way, evoke the form of the original poem, but very few translators actually attempt to reproduce the technicalities of the original form exactly. This presentation will be looking at three notable exceptions to this: a partial translation by J.R.R. Tolkien, and then two full translations by Ruth Lehmann and Chris McCully, respectively. I'll be focusing on lines 210 to lines 28 for reasons that will become obvious soon. And by close reading these against the original, I'll be exploring the various correspondence to and divergence from the original in translation. I'm then going to come full circle, so that the talk is not only 1/3 about Tolkien, to consider the form and style of Tolkien's later prose translation of Beowulf, and specifically why he chose prose and not verse for this translation. My comparative analysis of these temporal translations will highlight the various distinctiveness of both Old English and Modern English, and it will show how the dissimilar linguistic features of these languages affect the applicability of various poetic devices. I hope to provide new insights into how alliterative verse might be conveyed in Modern English, and how best to convey Old English poetry in Modern English. So to give you a little bit of an overview, Tolkien was no stranger to the alliterative verse form and actually used it for many original poems and translations, often dealing with legendary subjects and expanding on other literary sources, including those of his own. So the Lay of the Children of Húrin, for example, in the Lays of Beleriand, pertains to the first age of Middle-earth and deals with the fall of the character Turin Turambar. The paired poems, the New Lay of Gudrun and the New Lay of the Volsungs in the legend of Sigurd and Gudrun, are derived from stories from the Old Norse poetic Edda. The short poem King Sheev in The Lost Road is all about the founder of the Danish Scylding dynasty, whose arrival, rule, and funeral is the subject of the prologue of Beowulf. The dialogue poem The Homecoming of Beornoth Beorhtom's Son in Tree and Leaf was inspired by the Old English poem The Battle of Malden, which was based on a battle that happened in 991. The unfinished The Fall of Arthur, for which there are 120 pages of drafting, was inspired by the 15th century alliterative poem Mort Arthur. And also Tolkien used the form, Tolkien skillfully conveyed the alliterative verse form of the 14th century poem Sir Gawain and the Green Knight in his tastefully archaizing translation. So he used it all sorts of ways. But in his translation of Beowulf, which he revised, wrote a commentary for, yet never actually finalized for publication, he chose prose. Tolkien clearly could have made a full translation into alliterative verse if he wanted to, but clearly chose not to. I would like to explore why. So his choice of translation strategy in this regard might be explained by looking at his essay on translating Beowulf, which originally prefaced a revised third edition of Clark Hall's prose translation of Beowulf, which was published in 1940. This was a very popular crib among students well into the 1960s, and Tolkien's Beowulf was also mainly intended for students as well. So what he says here is applicable to his own translation, I would say. He says that Clark Hall's translation, and indeed any prose translation, is not offered as a means of judging the original or as a substitute for reading the poem itself. The proper purpose of a prose translation is to provide an aid to study. He goes on to say that the effort to translate or to improve a translation is valuable not so much for the version it produces as for the understanding of the original it awakes. So not leading from, but leading back to the original text. This pedagogical argument, interestingly, differs very much from his approach to Gawain, and we can look at Gawain and Beowulf in comparison here. So of his translation Gawain and the other poems in this particular collection, Pearl and Sir Orfeo, which are, I think, 13th and 14th century poems respectively, he says, the main object of the present translations is to preserve the meters, which are essential to the poems as wholes, and to present the language and style as they were for the people to whom they were addressed. So this is clearly a very imitative translation strategy focus that he has here. His approach is very different, as outlined by Christopher Tolkien in this publication of Beowulf. He says that Tolkien was determined to make a translation as close as he could to the exact meaning in detail of the Old English poem, far closer than can ever be attained by translation into, quote-unquote, alliterative verse. But nonetheless, he says importantly, with some suggestion of the rhythm of the original, a point we will come back to slightly later. So this is clearly a very pedagogical approach to this translation. So what we can see here is that in the case of translation, it's not a question of fidelity really, but of fidelities. Fidelity to sound or sense, to lexis or syntax, to form or content, and these can be variously promoted or demoted as the translator himself sees fit. And in Tolkien's case, he alters the form of his translations as his priority as a translator changes, whether they be primarily imitative or primarily pedagogical. So his essay on translating Beowulf then goes on to explore many of the issues involved in translating Old English poetry, especially regarding things such as word choice, style, and meter. In order to demonstrate some of these issues, Tolkien provides what he calls a free version of Beowulf lines 2:10 to 28, which is anything but free because it's in extremely technically precise alliterative verse. This imitative translation shows how Old English meter might be replicated in modern English, yet it differs from the original in all sorts of interesting ways. The passage that he chose to translate is very interesting. It occurs when Beowulf has heard of the attacks of Grendel. He departs his native Geatland with 15 picked men and sails towards Denmark. It's a sort of transitional passage before Beowulf's eventual arrival at the Hall of Heorot, where he will vow to kill the monster Grendel, at which the narrative really gets going. The lack of speech and abundance of descriptive detail in this passage means that it perfectly well illustrates how Old English alliterative verse is used both in the original and how it can be evoked in translation. As we can see here, Tolkien lists the half-line types, and so his focus is very clearly on meter, and he makes an interesting point about the absence of B verses in this extract and the plethora of B verses in his own translation. And in order to understand exactly what this means and what are the implications of this, I'm going to offer a quick crash course on alliterative verse. I know that for some of you, this is going to be the 101st time you see Siever's 5 types, but for some of you, this will be the first. So let's make sure we're all on the same page. So a line of alliterative verse consists of 2 half lines, an on verse and an off verse, which rhythmically consist of 2 lifts and 2 dips, which then constitute the 4, not 3, not 5, but 4 metrical positions that are necessary in specifically Old English alliterative verse. Lifts are essentially long syllables. They consist of 1 long vowel, a vowel and a consonant cluster, or 2 short vowels which are resolved, so understood as a long vowel. Anyone familiar with Greek or Latin meter, it's kind of similar in that regard. The dips, meanwhile, usually consist of 1 syllable, but can consist of any number of light syllables together. But only usually 1 position is expanded in any 1 half line, otherwise it would become too baggy. Metrical ictus, that is metrically significant stress, usually falls on words of greatest semantic importance, which tend to be nominals and which also tend to bear alliteration. So in this sense, metrical stress, semantic importance and alliteration all come together in how the rhythm is structured. Alliteration, which links the half lines, corresponds with the rhythmical structure of the line overall, by falling on usually the most strongly stressed parts of the line, as is outlined by this diagram. So the verse line consists of a strong on verse with a strong first lift, on sterven, and a weak second lift, stigon, and a weak off verse with a strong first lift, stremus, and a weak second lift, wundum. So as we can see here, the second lift, the first lift of the off verse is what is known as the headstave. It's kind of the crux of the line. It's the only place where alliteration must occur because it determines the alliteration for the rest of the line. And we can see also that alliteration must fall on the strongest part of the line. It may fall on the, as it were, the strong, weak part of the line, but it must not fall on that last stress here, the weakest part of the line. So the metrical patterns of each half line usually corresponds to 1 of 5 main metrical types, as outlined by Edward Sievers in 1893 in his System for Old Germanic Alliterative Verse, which has been variously expanded, amended, and criticized, as we heard in Raphael Pasquale's lecture earlier this term. Tolkien, Lehmann, and McCully do seem to be using more or less this system. It is the most regular system, the one most often used, and most systems are based on this, so it's the one which I think is worth understanding today. So to quickly go through the 5 types, we have type A, which is falling, stremus wundum, B, which is rising, on flodus acht, C, which is clashing, on berm naken, D1, which is a subdivision of D, falling by stages, Ceda sa nasus, D2, which is a kind of broken fall, first, fourth yawat, and E, which is a weird one, a fall and rise, neth long the first. Now, as we can see, the B type is not present in the passage that we're looking at, nor is type E. So I think that's enough of an abstract overview. Now let's see how it all comes together in the poem. So this is the Old English of the passage we'll be looking at. First forth yawat, floater was on Ödem, bat under Beowulf. Beornus Yerwa on Steven Stigon, Stremus Wundon, Sund with Sander, Sedges Baron on Beirm Naken, Beorte Fratwe, Gutseru Yatalich, Gumman Utshovan, Weras on Wilsith, Wudu Bundna. Yawada over Wyholm, Winde Yefuzed, Floater Farmy Hills, Fulchla Yelikost, oder dem Antied, Oldere Stolgeres, Wunden Sterne, Yawaden Hafde, dat daar liedende land Yasawan, Brimkle Wobikan, Belgen Stepe, Side Sanases. Dat was Sund Leden, Eldetes het Ende. Dan een oprade, weder leude aan Wang Stigon, Sauru Saldon, Serchen, Prusodon, Gutjawadu. Gode Thankoden, dat de hem Uthlade, Ethe Worden. So because alliteration is, of course, the most conspicuous feature of alliterative verse, and the one most often used by translators in their translations, it's a very good start for analysis here. So of the 18 lines in this passage, 12 of them bear double alliteration, so they have two sets of alliteration in the on verses. 213 is an interesting one where we can see a kind of linking alliteration, whereby Sedges Baron, which doesn't alliterate within its line, does alliterate with the following line, on Beirmnak and Berte Fratwe. So alliteration is used structurally and ornamentally. Of the lines that carry single alliteration, we can see that most of them are poetic compounds, Wundensterne, Gutjawadu, Uthlade, as well as the gerund Lievende. We also have some subdivisions of the main 5 types, which I won't go into in too much detail, other than to point out 217, which is very interesting. Yawata over Wyholm, which is essentially an expanded A type. Yawata over Wyholm, the Y at the beginning falling in an anacrusis, so it's an extrametrical syllable, which is not to be counted. And there's also an A3 half line in 219, which if we hear Oberim Antid actually only has one stress. This has two important functions. One, it gives a place for these cluster of function words to actually fall, and they're not usually stressed, so they can all be kind of piled up there. And it also varies the rhythm of the poem in general, so we don't have too much of a kind of 4-square rhythm. There's a bit of variety going on there. But alliteration is not just structural, it can be combined with other aural features, as we can see with the consonantal rhyme of Sund with Sander, which seems to onomatopoeically imitate the mingling of the sand and the seawater. So we can see that alliteration is a pervasive technique in Old English poetry, which is present in every single line of Beowulf in some form or another. How does Tolkien handle it? This is his translation of the same passage. Time passed away. On the tide floated under bank their boat. In her bows mounted brave men blithely. Breakers turning spurned the shingle. Splendid armour they bore aboard, in her bosom piling well-forged weapons. Then away thrust her to voyage gladly, valiant timbered. She went then over wave-tops, wind pursued her, fleet, foam-throated, like a flying bird. And her curving prow on its course waded, till in due season, on the day after, those seafarers saw before them shore cliffs shimmering and sheer mountains, wide capes by the waves. To water's end the ship had journeyed. Then ashore swiftly they leapt to land, lords of Gothland, bound fast their boat. Their burnies rattled, grim gear of war. God thank they then that their sea passage safe had proven. So Tolkien conforms to the patterns permissible in Old English alliterative verse quite closely. And in doing so, this does necessitate some syntactical readjustment, as we can see with these lines at the beginning. In her bows mounted brave men blithely. It seems slightly unusual that Tolkien didn't opt for the slightly more natural brave men mounted blithely in her bows, because, of course, the alliterative structure would have been exactly the same. But as we can hear from blithely in her bows, there would only be 3 positions, because we have that long medial dip. Tolkien is clearly aware of this, and that's why he avoids the slightly more natural wording here. So his translation in this regard is slightly less natural, but it is more poetic, and more importantly, it is more metrical. What it also means is that he's able to place this finite verb mounted at the end of the line. Now, as we can see, Old English verse tends to place finite verbs at the end of the line, so in the weakest position, which don't usually bear alliteration. Wundon, baron, shovan, yafuzad, yawadan, haldi, yasawan, leadan, stigan, hrissadan, sankadan, and wordon. Lots going on there. And we can see that Tolkien is doing the same thing in his translation as closely as he can. Floated, mounted, turning, piling, thrust her, pursued her, waded, rattled, proven. So the same kind of verb is being used in the same kind of position with the same kind of rhythm. So Tolkien is trying to create a translation here which is multiply imitative in terms of meter, word choice, and also word position. Slightly unusual is also the position of the adjective of the adverb away, which precedes its verb thrust. But as we can see, it does two things for Tolkien, and this is why he does it. It gives him alliteration on well-forged weapons, then away thrust her, but it also means that it's closer to the word order of the original guman ut shovon, the men out shoved. There does seem to be some dysfunctional alliteration in these half lines here, like when we see in due season, the alliteration falls on day, but in normal modern English, it's actually the stress on season that would be metrically more significant. The same thing occurs with foam-throated, with curving prow, and with wide capes. So this is something known as right-headedness, where it's usually the noun after the adjective that is most stressed. But it's offset in this regard by what is known as the left dominance rule of the alliterative pattern in Old English, which basically means, as John Tarasawa has outlined, and you can find his brilliant work on your handout, in an on-verse containing two nominals, alliteration usually falls on both words or the words on the left, but not the word on the right alone. And as we saw earlier, the A3 half line doesn't have, as it were, that first stress to avoid. So Tolkien seems to extend this particular rule, which he's aware of, to adjective noun structures to help him conform to the conventional alliterative patterning. And the alliterative patterning that he uses is so consistent that actually we can always tell what are the metrically significant alliterations in this translation, even when the Old English rules seem to cut across the instincts of modern prosody. So Tolkien is as close to the patterning of the Cebus types as possible and displays a really impressive understanding and a skill in applying them in his translation. However, there's always a however. This close imitation of the alliteration and meter of the original does come at the expense of certain other techniques of Old English poetry, in particular stylistic repetition and variation, generally known as apposition. So because lines 210 to 28 cover a sea journey of retainers to a new land, variation tends to occur on lexical items including boat, men, sea, landscape, treasure, motion, and passing of time, the accumulative variation of which Tolkien doesn't entirely convey. So if we just look at, for example, synonyms for boat, which include floater, baat, steven, bear, naken, wudu, floater, farmehels, wunden, steven, and sawadu, lots of words, we can see that Tolkien reduces the apposition of floater and baat to the single word boat. The adverb aboard and the nautical pronoun her obviates the need to translate either naken or wudu. Also, bows and prow replace the varied nouns steven and wundenstevne, although because they rhyme, they form a sort of variation of their own. And the past participle plus noun compound wundenstevne, literally a wound prow, is of course very difficult to translate literally. Elsewhere, Tolkien notes that when faced with such a compound, a translator will often hesitate between simply naming the thing denoted, that is, calling a boat, or resolving the combination into a phrase. And we can see that Tolkien does both things in different instances here. And in this case, he decides to do the latter, translating into the adjective noun phrase, her curving prow, the possessive pronoun, again supplanting a varied noun. There are other effects of Old English poetry which are lost in Tolkien's translation, however, including a kenning. And now a kenning is essentially a metaphorical compound which substitutes the simple term for something, usually for poetic effect or to supply alliteration. So when we see the nautical kenning sawadu, literally a seawood, so a boat, Tolkien replaces it with the simpler, familiar, and, of course, already used word, boat. By not replicating the variation in this translation, it has both stylistic consequences and structural implications. So the phrase, we can see this, the repeated phrasing of these formulaic half lines, on steven stigon, which means they climbed onto the prow, and on wang stigon, which means they climbed onto the boat. they form what is known as an envelope pattern, which sort of formulaically frames the start of the journey as the men board the ship and the end as they disembark. Tolkien's translation, "in her bows mounted, and they let to land," is of course accurate in meaning, but because they don't parallel each other in exact phrasing, the envelope pattern in the original is not evoked. So altogether, the variation in the original Old English is diluted in Tolkien's translation, which otherwise is very metrically exact. So clearly, meter is the focus of this translation over and above anything else. It does suggest, however, that such technical fidelity in the translation of Beowulf does risk undermining other less methodically observable poetic elements. But it's well done. So the metrically imitative translation that was demonstrated in part by Tolkien's translation was then exhibited in full 50 years later in Ruth Lehmann's Beowulf, an imitative translation. Lehmann was also a scholar of Old English and wrote, among other things, a brilliant essay on what she called the broken cadences of Beowulf, which displays her deep understanding of Old English meter. In her introduction, she makes a similar observation, as Tolkien did about the B types and the A types, which is about the morphological modification of English over time, which affects the rhythm of the language and so affects its approach to poetic meter. She says that inflectional endings have been lost or reduced so far that the most frequent rhythm of Old English, ending on an unstressed syllable, has given way to the iambic rhythm of the modern language. And she then goes on to say how this affects her approach to anacrusis, which, as we saw earlier, Iwada over Waihom, she basically extends it to types where it's not often used, but she tries to limit it to a single syllable. So she tries to make things a little bit easier for herself in translating it into modern English, but she keeps as faithful as she can. And I think her translation is very impressive. But let's see what the rest of us think. So this is her translation. Time travelled on, the transport on the seaway, the ship under sheer cliffs, shore swept with waves, with winding currents. Willingly fighters mounted the gangway. Men carried into the hollow hold handsome armour, well-made war gear. Warriors started and launched the vessel on its longed-for course. Off across the ocean, urged by breezes, foamy forestem flew like a bird, till by the set season of the second day, the craft with curved prow had covered the distance, and those sailing men saw land ahead, shore cliffs shining, sheer escarpments, wide sea headlands. Waters were traversed, travel ended. The troop of Vedas disembarked quickly, bounded landward, moored the wave floater. Mailcoats resounded, thick protectors. They gave thanks to God for a calm passage crossing the sea paths. So, unlike Tolkien, Lehmann reflects very much of the variety in the original translation. So, for example, she balances the abstract word transport with the concrete word ship. She translates the synecdochic word wudu into vessel, and she expands the compound Wundensterne into the phrase craft with curved prow. The compound Savudu becomes another compound in her translation, wave floater, the second element of which matches two previous instances of floater, which she translates variously as transport and forestem. By avoiding the slightly dodgy cognate floater for floater, she uses the synecdochic synonym. She uses forestem as the synecdochic synonym for ship, thereby supplying variation of her own. So in this sense, her translation is in a way more fully imitative than Tolkien's, showing a greater awareness for various poetic techniques beyond merely meter. And her ease with variation is complemented by her facility with meter, at least for the most part. There are some slip-ups. For example, in this line, flew like a bird, the verb flew, which is actually absent in the original, and the noun bird forms a type of foot which is called a choriamb, which basically has exactly the same problem that Tolkien avoided, as we saw, which is that it has three positions, flew like a bird. But otherwise, her translation is very close, and even when this seems to happen again with half lines like waters were traversed, it seems that actually the American pronunciation traversed is intended here. Lehmann is clearly aware that this is a slightly ambiguous word, and so she supplies linking variation in the following line to make the emphasis clear. Waters were traversed, travel ended, the troop of Vedas, and so on and so on. It's also very close to the half-line types in its imitative strategy, as we can hear that wide sea headlands has almost exactly the same rhythm as Sida San. So altogether, she shows a very great awareness of Old English meter and a very great skill in evoking it in her translation, at least when we take a very close look like this. When we zoom out, maybe the translation is not quite as easy to appreciate. This is the only imitative translation which is covered in Hugh McGuinness's book-length study of the translations of Beowulf, and he's not too kind to it. He says that it's interesting as a scholarly exercise, but does not work as a poem. He says that it seems to him quite stiff and stilted, that it has unnatural sounding expressions, and he believes that Lehmann struggles somewhat with the demands of meter. I think this is harsh, but somewhat fair. It does seem, perhaps in some cases, that the natural prosody of modern English does strain against the foreign constraints of the metrical system in Old English alliterative verse. But nonetheless, Lehmann's adherence to Siever's metrical types for the full length of a Beowulf translation, the first to do so, is impressive in itself, even if the translation, as a translation, is perhaps not entirely perfect. And it could be worse. Moving on to Chris McCully's Beowulf, a New Translation. McCully, like Tolkien and Lehmann, was a scholarly poet translator. His PhD thesis was written entirely on Old English verse form and metrics. The lengthy erudite afterword to his translation displays his metrical expertise, but comes across as peculiarly apologetic. The phrase, "I fudged it," recurs throughout as McCully expounds various aspects of Old English meter that his translation struggles to replicate, often in his own admission, unsuccessfully. McCully's translation has gone by far the furthest in adopting the various technical elements of Old English alliterative verse, but by his own admission, it does seem to have been more than he could handle. He actually admits in the afterword that he was not entirely faithful to the partial set of metrical constraints and found it wasn't flexible enough for him to create a truly metrical translation. But the attempt is nevertheless worth looking at, and so I will examine his passage as I have examined the others. Time passed and held the boat's passage, rucking under cliff falls. They climbed into the prow to watch tide races turbid with sand bloom, readied, bright polished battle treasures in the ship's structure, shoved off again on their mission intent, menacing, purposed on their enterprise in their iron-bound boat. Over the waves' pathways wide-waked they came, wind-cunning bird, a wry-necked craft. Soon, on the second of successive days, the crossing was done. At the decorated prow, the watchman pointed out the land, the estranging slopes, steep sea cliffs, nesses, headlands. That hurtling voyage was at an end, and up they stood, battle troop of Vedas, in a body jumping gunwales, making fast Mere's keel, mail shirts grated, thrown with effort. They gave thanks to God for safe crossing of the sundering tides. Very poetic one. So across lines 210 to 28, variation for men is almost as frequent as that for boat, from Beornus to Werdeler Leuder. McCully's translation erases almost all of this variation, with synonyms for men replaced usually by pronouns and subjectless verbs. So, for example, Sejas Baron becomes simply readied, Guman Udshovan becomes simply shoved off again, and Wereson Wilsith becomes the quite awkward, purposed on their enterprise. There is also a small but bizarre modification when Lievender, the plural sailors, literally the sailing ones, is replaced by the singular watchman, for a reason which is not clear to me. With this variation erased, the passage in general becomes a lot more verbal than nominal, emphasizing a variety of action over a variety of language. So it's much more like a modern poem than an Old English poem. But there are other problems with the prosody and rhythm and meter in McCully's translation. The fact that the word stigon is translated as they climbed, and stigon later on is translated they stood, is no small change. It highlights a morphological and syntactic difference between Old English and Modern English that causes McCully, and indeed all the translators, problems. And it's simply to do with a reversal of rhythm, that the falling rhythm of stigon becomes the rising rhythm of they climbed. Now, to tell you what I'm sure you all already know, the past tense in weak verbs in Modern English usually has a dental suffix, climbed, climbed, and in strong verbs usually has a modified vowel, give, gave. Person, meanwhile, is only marked in the third person present, climbs, gives, and in these particular instances, these morphological modifications mean that these verbs remain always monosyllabic. In the Old English, on the other hand, verbs change for person, number, and tense, with all sorts of suffixes which are always lightly stressed and so never bear metrical ictus. This means the rhythm is always falling in Old English poetry, or more often than not. So, for example, the verbal suffix on usually marks the third person plural preterite. In this passage, it usually is linked with the nouns for men. So, sedges baron means the men carried. But what we can see is that the most literal translation of the verb baron, they bore, results in a complete perfect reversal of rhythm. This is one of the reasons why historically alliterative verse was superseded by accentual syllabics, like the iambic pentameter with its rising rhythm, as Geoffrey Russum has outlined. The iambic foot provided an ideal site for the native iambic phrases that proliferated as inflectional endings were replaced by function words such as articles, auxiliary verbs, and prepositions. So this is the same problem that Tolkien notices with the increased use of B types in his translation, and that Lehmann makes in her expanding the use of anacrusis. It's also one of the reasons why alliterative verse, formulated for an older stage of the English language, is so difficult to write in modern English. And this discrepancy between Old and Modern English is even more marked in the case of translation when Old English meter and Modern English prosody overlap. So to fit a prosodic round peg into a metrical square hole, McCully is forced to make all sorts of exceptions to his own rules, quite significant ones, really. So, for example, he allows half lines such as most blessedly, which end on two unstressed syllables, even though it breaks a very important rule that half-line final drops must be monosyllabic. So the end of the half-line must always be a monosyllable. Why? Because otherwise you would never know where one half-line ends, where one begins, where you have anacrusis, what different half-line types you have. It's such an integral rule, and it's a strange one that he broke. So he also leaves certain deviant half-lines in the present translation. So when we encounter a half-line like on their enterprise, maybe we can resolve it so that it doesn't end on two syllables, but why would we bother? Maybe he's just left it in there as a deviant half-line. It takes away the fun of even scansion, which is the worst thing of all. Even when he says another exception to his rule that he puts in a much more freer use of enjambment, this only seems to work against the metrical integrity of his half-lines, as we can see in this example of a very clunky enjambment at the decorated prow. We have a deviant half-line that can't be resolved in any way possible. And of course, it's a B type with only one stress. So there's really nothing good about this half-line, and it undermines his translation strategy in general. So McCully's impressive range of metrical criteria for his imitative translation is completely undermined through the various exceptions that he makes to his own rules. The reader cannot possibly recognize where a rule is kept, where it is bent, and where it is broken, and it cannot possibly help the readers experience something of the textures and formal properties of the original, as the back cover to his translation claims. It's not for want of technical skill or specialist knowledge that McCully's translation falls short of its imitative aims. As I said, the afterword is very eloquent. It's rather that adopting the Old English verse form and keeping the natural Modern English prosody makes the process of translation almost impossibly difficult. McCully's translation was fundamentally motivated by what he saw as the essential continuities between Old English and Modern English, but morphologically and so prosodically and so metrically, the end result unfortunately suggests the opposite. Where does that leave Tolkien? So we can perhaps see now why Tolkien, who was able to use alliterative verse for original poetry and for translation, chose to translate Beowulf into prose. His prose translation of Beowulf obviously bears little formal resemblance to the original, but more importantly, for his pedagogical approach, it is very, very close to it in meaning. And of course, while the form of it doesn't conform to the original meter or alliteration, being in prose, obviously, it does nevertheless, as Christopher Tolkien said, evoke it through rhythmical qualities of its own. As Tolkien said, in essence, an Old English alliterative verse is made by taking the half dozen commonest and most compact phrase patterns of the ordinary language that have two main elements or stresses, and which are usually different and balanced one against the other to make a full line. Christopher Tolkien, in his introduction, detects a certain self-consciousness to the rhythm of this translation, which is evocative of just these kind of phrase patterns, although he says that it by no means invites analysis, which I obviously disagree with, and so I will now look at the seafaring passage in Tolkien's prose translation. Time passed on. Afloat upon the waves was the boat beneath the cliffs. Eagerly the warriors mounted the prow, and the streaming seas swirled upon the sand. Men-at-arms bore to the bosom of the ship their bright harness, their cunning gear of war. They then, men on a glad voyage, thrust her forth with her well-joined timbers. Over the waves of the deep she went, sped by the wind, sailing with foam at throat, most like unto a bird, until in due hour, upon the second day, her curving beak had made such way that those sailors saw the land, the cliffs beside the ocean gleaming, and sheer headlands and capes thrust far to sea. Then for that sailing ship the journey was at an end. Thence the men of the wind-loving folk climbed swiftly up upon the beach, and made fast the sea-borne timbers of their ship. Their mail shirts they shook, their raiment of war. They gave thanks to God that the passage of the waves had been made easy for them. So, as I said, Tolkien's prose has fundamentally different formal conditions from both his verse translation and, of course, the verse of the original. So the required 4 positions per half line in Old English would call for a minimum of 4 syllables per half line in any imitative translation. Free from this particular condition, Tolkien is able to open his prose of this particular passage, as you can see from the middle, with the triple beat of 3 monosyllables, time passed on. The monosyllabic preposition on is actually a closer translation to the Old English forth and avoids the incongruous funereal associations of passed away. Foregoing the alliterative verse technical requirements affects, as we can see, not only the rhythm, but also the sound structure and the meaning of Tolkien's prose. But Tolkien nonetheless evokes the form of the original through impressionistic and diverse rhythms. So, for example, in the second sentence, we can see it is structured like a 2-part alliterative verse line with 2 two-stress phrases balanced across the rhythmically unobtrusive verb was. Tolkien's prose, unlike the original Old English alliterative verse, is able to use more than merely alliteration as a linking device for such pairings. So as we can see here, he uses the rhyme afloat and boat to link these together, and does the same thing later with day and way. But lexically, of course, also waves and cliffs mirror each other as plural nouns, and the preposition and definite article phrases upon the and beneath the even echo each other as clusters of slack syllables between the stresses. So altogether it sounds like this. Afloat upon the waves was the boat beneath the cliffs. It has a beautiful harmony which is not possible in the Old English, but it is nonetheless quite evocative of it. We see the same kind of rhythmical doubling happening later with the phrases waves of the deep and sped by the wind. And we can also hear how easily Tolkien is able to accommodate these choriambic phrases that were so problematic in some of the previous translations that occur in Lehmann's and that were avoided in Tolkien's. They finally find their home in a prose translation. In the third sentence, it consists of 4 two-beat phrases in 2 clauses, which sort of resembles a pair of alliterative verse lines as I've laid them out here, and which has quite an intricate rhythmical structure. The 3 slack syllables of eagerly the warriors becomes 2 in mounted the prow, and becomes only 1 in streaming seas before returning to 3 in swirled upon the sand, so that the sentence forms, as it were, a sort of rhythmical envelope pattern of its own. Is this just accidental, or is this deliberate? I do think it is actually quite deliberate. It seems that Tolkien is deliberately varying the light syllables between his 2 stress phrases to modify the rhythm of his translation and to prevent the prose becoming monotonous. As he said elsewhere, there is no single rhythmical pattern to a line of alliterative verse. Rather, the half lines are founded on a balance and opposition between 2 halves, which are more often rhythmically contrasted than similar. And I would argue that Tolkien's prose translation captures something of this rhythmical contrast in the varied lilt of its 2-stress phrasing. But ultimately, this prose translation is pedagogical, so it prioritizes meaning at all points. The original meter and the alliterative structuring causes Tolkien's imitative translation to depart in meaning from the original at certain points, but the prose is much, much more freer to translate more faithfully. So as we can see, the word waves is much closer to the Old English udum, while the singular tide in his verse translation is required mainly for alliteration with time. The same thing happens with the word prow, which is much closer to the singular steven, while the plural bows is required for alliteration on bank and boat. The slightly odd phrase valiant timbered, as is used in his verse translation to translate wudu bundana, shows that Tolkien is being misled into a kind of artful abstraction by the requirements of alliteration on voyage, translating will seath, seath means journey. And in the prose translation, he's able to keep the word voyage, but with no need to alliterate. He's able to translate much more accurately with the phrase well-joined timbers. And morphologically, the expression glad voyage is much closer to the compound will cease than the phrase to voyage gladly. In Tolkien's prose translation, he gives his boat a curving beak in reference to it being fúlhlialíkost, most like a bird. In the verse, alliteration requires that this fleet, foam-throated bird become a flying bird, only then to wade in the next line, translating Yawaden, which means to advance and not wade as such. And lastly, a small change, but a significant one. They gave thanks to God is very much closer syntactically to the phrase Goda Thankoden, where you can see from that E at the end, God is in the dative, so to God. Also, the monosyllabic word thanked in the translation means that Tolkien requires at least one more syllable in his half line to meet the four metrical positions, and he fills it with the superfluous verb, adverb then. Of course, in his prose translation, there are no such requirements, and so there's no superfluity. So altogether, I would say that Tolkien's prose evokes the original sound patterning without being obligated to imitate it. He is able to vary the rhythm and sound patterning of his prose freely and creatively, while always at every point prioritizing the meaning. His translation may have been primarily pedagogical, but this by no means precludes the musicality which we see so often in Tolkien's prose. Here's another rainbow. We haven't seen enough of these this month. So what can we say ultimately? In the same way that the more one moves towards a rainbow, the further away it seems to get, the more a translation seeks to imitate its source text, the more it ends up actually distorting it. Translating from a dead language, which is the ancestor of the target language, is of course already uncannily difficult to do. But then translating from and into a verse form that fell out of use as that language developed is effectively impossible, as I've shown. The game is not the same if you have to change the rules, and so as Lehmann herself advocated, to each language its own verse forms. Appreciating Beowulf is arguably much better facilitated through prose. This leaves the original in its native linguistic context and provides the most efficient means for readers to approach it on its and indeed their own terms. Tolkien shows, however, that a prose translation need not forego rhythm, sound structure, and the general feel of alliterative verse. Without the obligations for imitation, however, the elements of alliterative verse can be used variously and voluntarily, always promoting and never compromising the meaning, the content of the original. Nonetheless, I would say that the continued reading, writing, and study of Beowulf in translation, whether prose or verse, imitative or otherwise, remains variously rewarding. It not only makes the Old English poem accessible to various audiences, but it reframes our living language historically, technically, and literarily. Thank you very much.